The expressions in our language that we use every day, even though their origins and their initial meaning have been completely forgotten. For instance, you still will hear some people say, hang up the phone, even though nobody has a phone that you can hang up. Everybody uses their cell phones for How many people have a landline? Raise your hand. 3, 4. Yeah. Well, you can still use hang up the phone. You 4. So, or we still use a phrase like, you sound like a broken record. I heard that not long ago, actually. What's a record? Let alone a broken one. Or sometimes you might still hear somebody say, roll up the window. Now, how does that work? I don't even remember rolling up the window. There are people in this room, well, let's just ask. How many people in this room have never rolled up a car window? Raise your hand. Nobody? That's hard to believe. That really is. Or there's a phrase like clockwise. Digital displays are making that terminology obsolete. I mean, almost nobody has clockwise anymore. And there are other such expressions, such as running out of steam, which comes all the way from the late 19th and early 20th century. Oh, hold your horses. Or put them through the ringer. Nobody still has an old-time washing machine out on the back porch that you put through the ringer. The phrases linger, but the concepts behind them that were once part of our lives are no longer recognized. And there is a spiritual word that tragically I now would have to put in the same category. It is the word holiness. I grew up hearing the word holiness all the time in the church. I grew up singing, holy, holy, holy. It's a hymn. We haven't sung it in forever. It used to be a major word in churches, holy and holiness. It simply means set apart or separate for the Lord. But we don't hear it much even anymore, to the point where many Christians don't even know what the word means. And I bring it up because Paul uses it in the first part of the text we have made our way to in 2 Corinthians in verse 1, where he says, we have these promises, dear friends, so let us cleanse ourselves from everything that can defile our body or spirit, and let us work toward complete holiness, because we fear God. So what does it mean, holy? Separated to God, special to God. We think of holiness and being holy as an intrinsic quality. What's holy is better or purer than what's not. And so Paul talks about holiness in the next verse in the way that he carries out his ministry. He says, please open your hearts to us. We have not done anything wrong to anyone, nor led anyone astray, nor taken advantage of anyone. He was ministering to God with a completely clear conscience. Though, as we've read in recent weeks, some of the Corinthians had been critical of him, he had been honest and straightforward with them, no hidden agendas whatsoever. And now he simply asked that they return the favor, that they show a similar respect toward him. And so we read the rest of our text that we'll look at tonight. He said, I'm not saying this to condemn you. I said before that you are in our hearts and we live or die together with you. I have the highest confidence in you and I take great pride in you. You have greatly encouraged me and made me happy despite all our troubles. When we arrived in Macedonia, there was no rest for us. We faced conflict from every direction with battles on the outside and fear on the inside. We'll come back to that phrase in just a minute. That's a powerful phrase. With battles on the outside and fear on the inside. But God, who encourages those who are discouraged, encouraged us by the arrival of Titus. His presence was a joy. That's why we sang those two songs in the beginning tonight. His presence was a joy, but so was the news he brought of the encouragement he received from you. When he told us how much you long to see me and how sorry you are for what happened and how loyal you are to me, I was filled with joy. Now, in this section of 2 Corinthians, Paul has been recounting in the last chapter some of the problems and troubles he faced. Even though he started the church at Corinth, there were members of the church who were making a lot of public accusations about his honesty and his integrity and his ministry. They were complaining and criticizing him. And in addition to problems with the church, Paul says he faced a multitude of personal problems. But instead of moaning and groaning about them, he used them as opportunities to display God's grace and power and, yes, even joy. So listen to me for a second. If you don't have any problems or troubles, you don't need to hear this message. You don't. But if you're facing any kind of troubles, financial difficulties, family conflicts, relational problems, physical problems, mental problems, emotional adversity, then you might want to pay close attention to these verses as we break them down tonight, because he literally talks about how to convert your troubles into joy. And I think that, my friends, is where we all want to be. When I was a kid, I loved reading superhero comic books. Superman was my all-time favorite. Every afternoon in elementary school for 6 years when I got out of school, my first grade teacher would take me down to the Western Auto Store where my mother worked and drop me off, and my mother would give me either a dime or a quarter to go down to the drugstore right next door to the Western Auto, and then I would wait for about an hour or hour and a half when my father would pick me up on the way back and then take me home. So, with that dime or quarter or whatever I saved up of those dimes and quarters, I would often buy Superman comic books. Then I would come back, sit down in the Western Auto floor room in front of a television and watch Superman on TV at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a great childhood. If I wasn't buying Superman comic books, I was buying baseball cards. How I wish, like so many others, that I still had the thousands and thousands of baseball cards from the 50s and 60s. This one card sells for in the millions. That's dollars. But my mother threw them away, and we've all heard the story of mothers throwing away comic books that are very valuable, like the one I just showed, and baseball cards. But I love to do that kind of thing, and I really love that 4 o'clock showing every afternoon of the adventures of Superman. I liked Superman. I liked other superheroes, but Batman came on after Superman. But he didn't have superpowers. He was just a smart guy with a bunch of neat tools in his belt. He wasn't the same. I mean, he wasn't nearly like, Superman was faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. And so I loved Superman. And I'm telling you this because I used to have this misplaced fantasy that Bible characters were superheroes who possessed superpowers. I really did. I mean, I would do that every afternoon after school in the 1st through 6th grade, and then I would go to Sunday school at my church and Wednesday night Bible class at my church, where the teachers would tell me stories about Moses parting the Red Sea. I'm not even sure Superman could have done that. And tell me stories about Daniel in the lion's den. and tell me stories about Elijah defeating 850 false prophets on Mount Baal, 850 to 1. And there were all these wonderful, fascinating stories. And so to me, I couldn't really make the separation. Do you understand what I'm saying? Between Superman and Batman on Monday through Friday and Wednesday night and Sunday morning, the Bible characters who seemed like superheroes too. But as an adult, I've been cured of that myth by simply reading about all the problems and pain these Bible characters faced, including Paul, and we just read about some that he faced. There used to be a show called The Perils of Pauline. Does anybody remember that? Yeah. Well, when you go back to some of Paul's words in chapter 6 and here, we read about the perils of Paul. Let me just read a couple of lines from chapter 6 where we were 3 weeks ago tonight. In troubles, hardships, distresses, in beatings, imprisonments and riots, sleepless nights and hunger and dying. Yet we live on. Wow. Now that's what he said in chapter 6. But it doesn't seem to get a whole lot better in chapter 7. In verse 5 of our text, he said, when we arrived in Macedonia, there was no rest for us. There was no rest for us. So physical fatigue he began to face. Are you suffering physically today? Have you ever gone a few days without sleep or without much sleep? You know just how bad that is for you and what that can do to your body? Paul's body was racked with pain from frequent beatings and from a lack of sleep. The great Hall of Fame football coach Vince Lombardi was right when he used to say constantly, fatigue makes cowards of us all, because it does. I've been there. Probably you have too. As you look around today, it seems like most everybody seems tired. Some people are really tired. They're working 2 and 3 jobs. Paul can identify with that. He said there was no rest for us. He didn't say there was a lack of rest for us. He said there was no rest for us. And then he said we faced conflict from every direction. Depending on the translation you're reading, one says personal attacks. He says in another translation, I've been harassed at every turn. Everywhere Paul went, there were those who publicly and viciously opposed him. Have you ever been the target of angry words, of hostile words, of people giving you conflict from seemingly every side? I mean, I know we all grew up as kids hearing sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. But we learn by the time that we are in adolescence, maybe it's the first breakup of a love relationship, maybe it's the loss of a best friend that we wind up in a fight with, maybe it's the divorce of a parent where there's been a lot of verbal abuse in the home. We learn pretty quickly, at least by adolescence, that simply is not true. That this is more true. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but heartless words cut deeper. For wood and stone harm flesh alone, but language costs are steeper. That's absolutely true. I know we live in a time of great conflict right now where nobody likes the current president, or most people don't like the current president, and most people don't like the previous president. And there's a lot of political ill will on both sides. But let me tell you, no president ever faced as much of that as Abraham Lincoln did. The whole South despised him, the entire South. And about half to 2/3 of the North did too. Lincoln was under constant criticism and pressure. And somebody one time called him two-faced. And I love what he said. He said, if I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one? I love that. You just now got that, Peter? That took a little while there. That took just a little while for that. He also was the one who said this, and it's one of my favorite quotes on criticism that I've ever heard. He said, if I care to listen to every criticism, let alone act on them, then this shop may as well be closed for all other businesses. I have learned to do my best, and if the end result is good, then I do not care for any criticism. But if the end result is not good, then even the praise of 10 angels would not make a difference. How true that is. Paul faced personal attacks, verbal attacks, and then he spoke of two areas that I mentioned when we were reading the text for the first time that I would come back to. Battles on the outside, fear on the inside. Boy, that is a double-pronged attack, is it not? Battles from the outside, fear from the inside. Battles on the outside applies to troubling circumstances over which we have no control. There are only two kinds of circumstances in life, those that we can do something about and those that we can't. There are so many things that can go wrong in our lives that we cannot control. I have really tried hard over the last few years to train myself to not pay any attention to criticism, complaints, or problems that I simply cannot do anything about. You can't control it. You can't do anything about it. You're not the person able to fix it. Why do you need to spend time with it? I've worked really hard on that. There are some things that immediately come to our mind. The weather, and hurricanes. I can't do anything about those things. Other people's behavior, the way other people think, the economy. I mean, on and on I could go. I can't do anything about any of those things. That's why I don't ever much get my nose out of sort about politics, because I can't do anything about that. I can't fix the economy. I can't fix weather or climate. I can't fix hardly any of that. All I can fix is me. And then inward fears. There were times when Paul feared for his own life, and he should have, because he was stoned and left for dead. Fear can absolutely paralyze you. At the height of the Great Depression in 1933, you remember that Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper." So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And this is so true of people. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. See, what I've found with that quote is almost everybody in America learned this in school, probably in elementary school, and they can tell you one line. They can tell you this line: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But it's the next line. It's the next line that is so important, and not just to individuals in our nation, but particularly to Christians. It's that next line that is so important. There are other things to fear rather than fear itself. I fear rattlesnakes. I do. I kind of fear all snakes, but particularly poisonous snakes. I got close to getting bit one time, and so I fear hurricanes. We've had 4 in the last 20 years since I've lived here. 4 pretty major ones, and I've seen so many people hurt from them that I fear that. Fear is paralyzing and can rob you of life. It's one of Satan's most successful ploys. But most of the things we fear never materialize. My favorite acrostic for fear is false evidence appearing real, because so many of the things we're afraid of and worry about never happen. They don't. As you look at this, you can relate to what Paul said, and you can relate to some of the troubles he faced. So after mentioning all these troubles, Paul wrote, "But God, who encourages those who are discouraged, encouraged us." Here's the first way he encouraged him: the arrival of a good spiritual friend, Titus. His presence was a joy, but was also the news he brought of the encouragement he received from you. So his second part of his encouragement was that the brothers and sisters in Christ were praying for him and cared about him. And maybe in some instances, he had overblown in his mind just how much opposition he faced. Have you ever done that? One critic can sound like 100. It's just true. The secret of converting your trouble into joy is found in what he explains in this text as a relationship with God. First, you turn to God when you are first in trouble, not well down the road. Earlier in this same letter, Paul wrote, "All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort." He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. And when they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. He recognized, first of all, that God is the only reliable source of comfort and strength in times of trouble. Have you ever known somebody who was ill? Or maybe it was you even. And the doctors have done most everything they can do, and so they say, well, the only thing you can do now is pray. And when a sick person hears that, they sometimes grimace and say, oh no, has it come to that? In other words, they act as if prayer is the last resort. But seeking God in our trouble shouldn't be the last resort. It should be our first source. Our first source for all comfort. I was thinking of a way to illustrate that, so let me try to give one here. How many of you rode in a car to church tonight? Raise your hand. All right, I think that's probably all of us. How many of you checked on the status of your spare tire before you got in the car, or have checked on the status of your spare tire in the last month or the last 6 months? You did? It's that bad. You had a flat today. Sir, you are not allowed to say that in the sermon. You've just blown my entire illustration. I'm kidding, of course. He only checked on his spare tire because he had a flat. Actually, you've added to my illustration. That's all the better. None of us checked on our spare tire tonight, last week, the last month. You just assume it's there in case you need it, in case of a blowout or a flat. And he needed it. And it was there. And I think some Christians inadvertently and unintentionally treat God much like they do a spare tire. And you know, he's there somewhere in the background, and you just assume he'll be available to help you if and when a blowout or a flat occurs, and you don't have any other resource. So let me ask you, when you face trouble, trials, problems, like Paul talked about in this text, is God your first source or your last resort? King David, who was no stranger to pain and trouble, wrote, God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. Now I read that, and you know what? You know how I interpret that? God doesn't want to be your 911 number. He wants to be your 24/7, 365 number. Your ever-present help right now. And so, turn to him first. And as we sang tonight, look for joy even in the midst of trouble. If you think you'll only have joy after you've passed through your time of trouble, then you'll miss out on the joy you could be experiencing in the midst of your trouble. Same author, David. When I said, my foot is slipping, your unfailing love, Lord, supported me. When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought me joy. Notice David didn't say, after my foot slipped, after I had regained my balance, I had joy. No, it was while his foot was slipping, while he was suffering from great anxiety, God's presence did exactly what we read a moment ago. Comfort and strengthened him, an ever-present help in trouble. It was while Paul was going through these issues and problems and trials and temptations and troubles that God brought him the joy we read about in 2 Corinthians 7. While you're in the middle of pain, you have a choice. You have a choice to either focus on your trouble or look for joy. The choice is yours. In other words, trouble is inevitable, but misery is optional. I love the little poem, Trouble, by David Keppel. Better never trouble until trouble troubles you. For you only make your trouble double trouble when you do. And the trouble, like a bubble that you're troubling about, may be nothing but a cipher with its rim rubbed out. That's so true. When Paul was suffering, another way that God converted his trouble into joy was by sending his friend Titus to be with him. Now, Titus was so close to Paul. I mean, you could make an argument he might have been his best friend, his best spiritual friend. He absolutely, certainly was in the top three. I mean, he left Titus, you remember, on Crete after Paul had established churches there. He left his friend there to help lead and strengthen the churches. He went with him on missionary journeys. Titus, very important. And so it was a balm to his spirit for Titus to show up and be there with him in person. It sort of reminds me of the little boy who was frightened in his room when there was a thunderstorm rumbling overhead, and he cried out to his daddy, "Daddy, I'm afraid. Can you come in here and hold me?" And his daddy said, "You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Don't be afraid, son. God is in there with you." And after a few minutes, he came running into his daddy's room and said, "Dad, I know God is in there, but I need someone with some skin on." Paul needed somebody with some skin on. Titus was the skin. We need that too. Sometimes we need somebody with some skin on, and that's why God gave us friends, and that's why God gave us the church, and that's why God gave us people we can associate in fellowship with, our brothers and sisters in Christ, because Proverbs 18:24 says, there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. A friend is someone who walks in when everybody else walks out. You'll have a lot of acquaintances in your life, but if you only have 2 or 3 really close friends, you are a rich person. And maybe there's somebody in here tonight who's thinking, I wish I had a friend like that. Well, try being a friend. Try helping somebody else through their tough time. They won't forget you. They won't. Even with all the problems Paul had with the congregation at Corinth, he wrote, I have the highest confidence in you, and I take great pride in you. You have greatly encouraged me and made me happy despite all our troubles. Paul was separated from the people in Corinth, but the report that Titus brought to him from Corinth served to encourage him. You know, in the old song, Home on the Range, There's a line that says, where seldom is heard a discouraging word. That, my friend, should be a description of every church. God intended his church to be a place of encouragement where seldom is heard a discouraging word. Did you know there is only one verse in the entire New Testament that talks about attending church? Only one. A part of that is because in the first century, people lived all together in the same small communities and villages. There was very little distance or space. There were no cars. There was no to separate them. There was no internet. They all lived very closely together. So they were together all the time, a way different way from living than we all have. But in that one verse in all the New Testament on attending church, and you can probably quote it, Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling of the saints together. That verse says that we should not miss meeting together with other believers, because the previous verse says we should be spurring one another on to good works and encouraging one another. The reason we gather together is to worship God, but it's not the only reason. The only verse in the New Testament that commands us to do so actually tells us the reason you're doing so is to spur one another on to love and good works and encourage one another. I wish I could say that every church is a place where seldom is heard a discouraging word, but I don't want to lie to you. Sadly, attending church for some people has been less than encouraging. I don't think that happens very much here. I hope it doesn't happen at all. But there is someone today that you'll meet who may be facing the worst crisis of their life, and your smile, your handshake, your hug, your support, your words, your encouragement may help them more than you will ever know. Sort of reminds me of the man who woke up one Sunday morning and he told his wife, "I'm not going to church today. You go and take the kids. I'm not going. I just don't want to go. Nobody's friendly to me and I don't get anything out of it." And his wife said, "I think you should get up and go to church." And he said, "Well, just give me 3 reasons why I should." And she said, "Okay, number 1, the Bible says we should stay in the habit of attending church. Number 2, the kids and I need you to set a good example for us. And number 3, you are the preacher." You may be the one in need of encouragement today, or I may be the one in need of encouragement today. And the best way to receive encouragement is to give it to other people. Encouragement is kind of like a boomerang. It comes back around to you when you give it. Are you allowing, like the Apostle Paul talks about in our text, God to convert your troubles into joy? Now, when you try that, let me just tell you, here's a temptation that's going to happen to you. I've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, but listen carefully. Here's a temptation that's going to happen. Here's a criticism somebody may make to you. They may say, well, they've just got a Pollyanna-ish attitude. They've got a Pollyanna mentality. But you know what? I don't take that as a criticism. If you know the true story of Pollyanna, I take that as praise. Really. The older I get, the more I love and appreciate the story of Pollyanna. It was first a best-selling novel written by Eleanor Porter in 1913. And based on the success of the first book, 11 more sequels were written, which are called Glad books. G-L-A-D, Glad books. And since then, the story has been adapted for stage and for film. And in the story, Pollyanna is an orphan, the child of missionaries, who has been sent to live with her straight-laced aunt. Pollyanna's philosophy of life centers on what she calls the glad game. And the game consists of finding something to be glad about in every situation. That's as biblical as you can possibly get. Several of the epistles say that exact same thing. Be thankful in all circumstances. Be joyful in all circumstances. And the glad game originated one Christmas when they opened the missionary barrel that had come as gifts, hoping to find a doll that Pollyanna had requested and asked Santa Claus and everybody else for, and instead of a doll, they discovered a pair of crutches. And Pollyanna's dad made up the game on the spot and asked Pollyanna to look at the crutches and try to think of something to be glad about. And Pollyanna thought for a moment and she said, I'm glad because I don't need crutches. And in the story of Pollyanna, her positive attitude changes an entire town. I want to challenge you to play the glad game yourself. The next time you're feeling down and low and slow, play the glad game yourself. What can you find to have just a little speck of joy, happiness, and God to make you glad in that moment? I play it a lot. I probably shouldn't tell this. My wife were in here, she'd be mad at me if I told this. But she ain't in here. She's teaching the 3rd through 5th grade. I recall a few years ago, a lady was criticizing me pretty heavily out here in the hallway for something I said or did, or I don't even remember what it was. My wife walked by and she was not too happy about it either. And I don't recall the details, but she got up in my face and was really letting me have it. And I tried to stay as sweet and as kind as I could throughout the whole thing and assured her of my desire to clear it up. I can't even remember what it was, but to do better or whatever. And as she walked away, I played the glad game. I said, I am glad that I am not married to that woman. You can find something to be glad about. Paul did in this text. We can too.